Welcome to the Culture is Healing podcast, brought to you by Checking In. At Checking In, we create customized wellness tools for First Nations communities, centering each nation's language, culture, and traditions to support healing and well-being for their people. To learn more about our work at Checking In, please visit our website at checkingin.co. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoy this episode. Aichka. Aichquel, Ichual, Antapa Huokulitza, Nitstaminis Halalt, Kowatson, Lyaxin. Hello, everyone. My traditional name is Huokulitza. My English name is George Harris Jr., and I am calling in today from my home here in Staminis. This is the community that my father is from. This is the community that my mother married into. And this is the community that my siblings and I were raised in. I belong to George Harris Sr. and my late mother, Sylvia Harris. My grandparents from my father's side of my family are the late Lawrence and Irene Harris. My grandparents from my mother's side of my family are the late Bernard and Nora George. My familial connections to Halalt come from my mother Sylvia and my grandmother Nora. My familial connections to Kowatson come from my grandfather Bernard. Through both sides of my family, I have familial connections to Lyaxin. And the name Huokulitza, it's a name that has been passed down from generation to generation throughout my father's side of my family. My father carries the name. He's since passed the name on to myself as well as a few other family members, and we carry that name proudly. And once again, thank you all for tuning in, and welcome you all to the Culture is Healing podcast. Once again, my name is Huokulitza, and I will be your host today, and really looking forward to sitting down with Waubgeshig Rice, and I would love to open the floor to my friend Waub to introduce himself to y'all. That's it.
Miigwech, thank you, George. Bonjour, Waubgeshig Indigenous, Makwat Ndodem, Wasak Sing Ndonjba, Anishinaabe Minwa Jagana Shindao. Hi, everybody. My name is Waubgeshig. I'm a member of the Bear Clan of the Anishinaabe of Wasaksing First Nation. That's an island community on Georgian Bay near Parry Sound, Ontario. I'm of both Anishinaabe and Canadian heritage. Father is Anishinaabe, specifically Ojibwe and Potawatomi, and my mother is of settler descent, going back to the UK, several generations. My home community is Wasaksing, and I also have roots in Shawniga First Nation. And on my Potawatomi side, lineage goes all the way back to the Menominee people of what's now called Wisconsin. I currently live in Sudbury, Ontario, which is also known as Swakamuck. And where I live now and where I'm originally from are lands that are part of the Robson-Huron Treaty that was signed in 1850. I'm a dad of 3 boys. My wife is also of Anishinaabe and Canadian heritage with roots in Garden River First Nation, also known as Bawating. And it is just a great honor, great pleasure to sit with you, George, today to chat and to talk about culture and to talk about healing. I'm an author. That's what I do for a living. I'm a former journalist. I am a journalist by trade. Graduated from what's now called Toronto Metropolitan University in 2002 with a journalism degree. And I'm also an ongoing language learner. I'm currently taking Anishinaabe in program development through Georgian College in Barrie, Ontario. I'm in my second year of that program. I have listened to and picked up my language, the language of my people, my entire life, but I've never been a fluent speaker. And that's my goal at the moment, is to take this program and hopefully get closer to fluency. That's what I aim to do before I'm too old anyway, while my kids are still young.
Mm.
And I just have really had the privilege and the great fortune of sharing stories my entire life, and to make a living off of stories, and most importantly, sharing experiences, sharing history, sharing culture, and so on, between Anishinaabe communities and peoples, but also more broadly Indigenous peoples right across what we call Turtle Island, and also to open the door to people of settler descent too, to share our beautiful ways, our beautiful stories,
Mm.
in hopes of creating, a good partnership and good harmonious relationships on this land through sharing stories about who we are and so on.
Mm.
And yeah, there's lots more I could share, and I'm sure that's going to come out organically through our conversation. But I just want to say Chimigwech, big thanks again for inviting me on the show today.
Haichka. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time, Waub, and yeah, it's such a meaningful full space to hold for people to share some of their own experiences within regards to some of the questions we bring up, and the first one I always love to hear what people have to share within regards to culture is healing. That is a saying that we hear quite frequently in our indigenous communities, and our elders are the champions of that true understanding of what like culture and healing means. They fought so hard for us to be able to much like your own journey, learning your language and relearning. I think, and undoubtedly there's um, part of it that's ingrained within us. Our language and and often that language and culture very much go hand in hand, and I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. When you hear that saying of culture is healing. So what does that mean to you, Bob?
I think my life has gone the privileged and fortunate way it has, thanks to engaged cultural healing that I witnessed from a very young age. I in some ways, believe I am a byproduct of cultural healing.
Mm.
When I was a child back in the 1980s, a lot of people in my home community of Wasaksing were making serious concerted efforts to revive culture, to bring back ceremonies, to bring back the drum, to bring back language, to bring back educational sovereignty, essentially, to teach the kids, informed almost entirely by Anishinaabe ways, Anishinaabe belief systems, history, practices on the land, and so on, right? So as a kid, my most vivid memories are of sitting at the drum for the first time,
Mm.
going into a sweat lodge for the first time, seeing my father especially make some very profound connections with the way of life that he had been denied since childhood, right? As a day school survivor, and as someone who was just ashamed, forced had this forced shame about being Anishinaabe thanks to settler society, right? So, and I give full credit to my mother as well, of settler background, for fully supporting my father at the time and raising me and my brothers to be profoundly proud of who we were as
Mm.
Anishinaabe, right? And in the 80s, that wasn't as common as it is today. There were still several communities right across the land that were dealing with the ongoing hardships of being colonized, of being brutalized, of being shamed out of culture, and so on, right? So yeah, as I had this front row seat to this cultural renaissance of sorts, I knew pride in myself and my identity from almost the beginning of my life, which has been so empowering, on a daily basis today at 46 years old. So I saw how people, healed from the traumas of residential schools, day schools. I saw how people moved away from substances. thanks to the circle that they went into in ceremony, you know, going fasting, going into sweats, and so on. And I guess that just sort of snowballed throughout the rest of my life, right? You know, my generation, there were very few of us who were given Anishinaabe names from birth and raised that way. You know, I was one of only a few kids in our community who had the blessing of a Anishinaabe name right from the beginning. But now I'd say more than half of the kids in our community have Anishinaabe names now, probably even more, you know? So that empowerment and that pride, you know, it naturally and organically sort of spreads, and it's just been really wonderful to see how that has unfolded over the course of my lifetime. And of course, like, it's not all there, you know, like, not everybody has made it that far
Mm.
yet. It's going to take a lot of work for a lot of people still to find that healing through culture, but fortunately, there are more and more role models nowadays, right? There are more
Mm.
examples people can turn to see that path to healing. So yeah, it to me, it came down to like really tangible things, like sitting at the drum and learning how to play a song, to more emotional and spiritual things like recognizing self, feeling empowered to learn language and stories and so on, and really find ways to make those connections with the generations older than us, our peers, and also as we grew older, the generations coming up after us, right? So it has really helped me look forward by looking backwards and
Mm.
see what the potential is there, right? And of course, like, culture takes on so many different meanings, and there are so many different elements to it. But on I guess, a very basic level, you know, explaining as concisely as possible, just seeing those examples from childhood, I think, has made me the person I am today.
Mm. Yeah, Aichka. Oh, I love hearing that. And I think too, like, people in our generation, we're fairly lucky that we didn't have to go through the same things that our grandparents and our parents had gone through,
Hmm.
and we were able to start that process of that reintroduction of language into our communities, and that was like the stepping stones for so much more. And
Hmm.
I think even even just hearing yesterday, or on Saturday, yeah, I was down in Cowichan, and got to attend the AGM meeting for It's Out in Laleham, which is a healing house in our territory, which colonial terms people call it a treatment center. And and my father, hearing his stories about the work that him and some other people had to do to get this organization off the ground, and his own personal journey to his sobriety and his healing journey, and a lot of that did really surround culture. And he
Hmm.
was saying from in the past, where people heavily used substances to numb that pain that they had from residential school and day school and Indian hospitals, and all of the other horrific institutions that existed to
Hmm.
suppress our people, and the attempts to erode our culture away.
Hmm.
And a lot of our old people, he was saying, like, really turned to our culture to bring healing. And he was saying, 30, 40, 50 years ago, it was not uncommon to have someone show up to one of our traditional homes, and they'd be under the influence of something. Now, if in today's day and age, if someone showed up like that, they would, be asked to leave, or they would be escorted out, because there's that understanding now that that doesn't have a place in our home. And that really sets like the tone, and that respect for our culture. And oh, it's been so amazing to see those shifts happening. And even I was sharing with a relative recently, and he was mentioning how um, it's been really amazing for him to be able to tune in to um, our episodes and be able to hear, like, I start off our introductions in my Hulkaminam language,
Mhm.
and I always end the episodes as well in our Hulkaminam language. So I'm really bookending them as best I can with the little knowledge I do have.
Mhm.
But it's still every single little part that we can preserve is still that preservation piece that I
Mhm.
think is still so important. And I love hearing your journey into, you doing your part to, learn your language. And like you're saying, it's not just for you, for your kids and,
Mhm.
and, further down the line, your grandkids and your great grandkids and so on. And it's just so encouraging. And so, thank you for sharing that part of your journey as well.
Oh, my pleasure. You guys, thank you. Yeah, and you raised a really good point too there about the bits we are able to conduct and carry with us on a daily basis. If this country had its way, if John A. MacDonald, Duncan Campbell Scott, all those dudes had their way, we'd have none of this stuff, right? It would have all been gone. We would have been totally absorbed, totally assimilated, with only memories lingering amongst the older ones of what we used to have and what we used to be able to do. But thanks to those old ones who resisted and who were able to hang on and be resilient to pass these things down to us so we can pass them on further. It's just like, it's just so powerful to consider that, right? And as I mentioned earlier, there's loss that's been lost. Some stuff may not, carry through to the next generations, but at the same time, we still have a lot of it, right? And that's testament to the old ones for sure.
Mm. Yeah, it's been amazing to see, and glad that our elders did fight so hard, and I think of, my father, and he has a literal, like, scar, like, on his right wrist from speaking our Hulkaminam language in residential school. And then he was like, I have this. This reminds me to let me know that I fought
Hmm.
to save what I have and what I know. And it's such a
Right on.
powerful,
Yeah.
thing for this, elder to be able to share. And so it's really interesting. And yeah, and so as we're kind of taking a look into culture, and there is a multitude of different activities and ceremonies that we have the opportunity to partake in. And I was going to ask you if there are any of those ceremonies that either you've witnessed or partook in that you really hold a special place in your heart.
Hmm. Yeah, I think one of the most regular ceremonies that I've done throughout my life is a sweat lodge. Many of our indigenous cultures practice that, and why I always recognize that one specifically is when I was a little kid, when these cultural practices started reemerging in our community. The first sweat lodge I ever went to was at night. It
Mm.
was total darkness, very late. And the ones I went to afterwards were always at nighttime too. And I didn't recognize at the time why that was. I just thought that's what we do as an Anishinaabe. We have sweat lodges in the night. But that wasn't necessarily always the case. These ceremonies happened whenever they needed to happen.
Mm.
But the reason we had them at nighttime in our community was because traditionally or historically, that's when the Indian agent was off shift, right? So
Mm.
the Indian agent couldn't come and break up the ceremony, which was illegal under the Indian Act, right? So that's why our ancestors within our community of Wasaksing would hold these ceremonies at night when the Indian agent wasn't paying attention, right? And they literally, under the cover of night, revived this practice, held
Mm.
on to it. And that sort of formed a habit of having sweat lodges at nighttime, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like a weird sort of hybridization of like resilience, but also surviving like oppression at the same time, and fashioning, I think, a new identity as a result of that trauma, essentially. Which is so bizarre, but at the same time so inspiring that they found a way to keep it going. So I always reflect on that, and just those measures that people took to make sure they held on to these things and passed them on. And also in our community, people would hold different kinds of ceremonies, like in the basement at nighttime, with very low light, so that nobody would see and they wouldn't be arrested essentially for doing that. So that's why I always like immediately think of the Sweat Lodge, and how it reemerged in our community, and the importance of that. I went fasting when I was very young for the first time, about 11 years old, and that was a very formative experience for me too, just in terms of like seeking a vision, acquiring one, and then figuring out a path forward after that. At a fairly young age, was pretty amazing. So on top of that, there are the daily sort of offerings of gratitude, like putting down my tobacco whenever I feel is necessary, smudging with our family when we need to, and also like the cultural celebrations like powwows and drum socials and things like that, right? So I'm not as deeply immersed in cultural practices as I was when I was a kid, like having moved to cities afterwards, and then having to conform to like capitalistic requirements of making a living and supporting family and stuff like that. But I think, what my wife and I try to convey to our kids on a daily basis is just that mindfulness that comes inherently with being the Anishinaabe, of being thankful on a daily basis for what we have, for our health, for our relatives, for the natural world around us, and so on. And I think a big part of that too is spending as much time outside as possible. So this may not be necessarily ceremonial, but I was very fortunate to be raised in the bush with a few things that I picked up along the way that family taught me. So yeah, I'll just go for a walk with my kids in the bush, and tell them what I know about harvesting various things, and the words in our language for various objects and various practices and so on. So I think there are those bigger picture things that I tried to abide by, but I think culture inherently is a mindset, and it's something that you need to humble yourself daily to engage with. But most importantly, as I mentioned earlier, be thankful all the time. And I think that's, to me, that's what being the Anishinaabe is essentially, that's the essence of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love hearing you say that too. It's culture is a mindset. And my parents would always say, when you make that choice to live a traditional life, like it's not just something that you pick up and put down. It's the way you carry yourself. And you have to make sure that you're conducting yourself in a good way that's a good representation of not just you but your whole family.
Yeah.
And thinking about like some cultural aspects. I know for me, just a couple weekends ago, it was my late Auntie Pearl's memorial, and in our communities here in the Coast Salish, we follow protocol that after 4 years after the person's passed is when we host their memorial ceremony. And we had the opportunity to honor my auntie, and so it was there to support my cousins as they walk through this journey. And my auntie absolutely loved jam sessions, and so that's something that was like becoming more common in recent times. And she loved hearing and seeing our young people engaged in our songs and dances. And so her children, said like, this is what we got to do for mom. Like we'll host her memorial, and then afterwards we're gonna host a jam session. So
Nice.
it was really cool to be able to see some of that. And actually my father and my sisters and I along with some of our young wolves uh, group here in Staminas. Actually saying as her picture was going around the floor, um, she was there when my father had brought out our Staminas Mistimuch song to our community, and to be able to showcase it. Now it's kind of our, how Canada has a national anthem, Staminas, our community, we have our own Staminas Mistimuch like anthem now.
Right on.
And so she was there for that, and so we honored her with singing the Staminas Mistimuch song. And yeah, we all got really emotional afterwards, like after we were done singing our four verses there. And yeah, it was really, really cool to be able to partake in stuff like that, because previously that type of thing, 20 years ago, was
Mm,
not very common. Yeah, and even some of the smaller things like you're mentioning, that might not be ceremony, but it's still important.
mm,
Recently I was up in Grouse Mountain over in Vancouver, and I was doing some work for another company that I work for called Culturally Committed. We were hosting an event um, with BC College of Oral Health professionals, and we had an elder from Squamish. His name is William Nahaney, and him and I don't know each other. And so he's like doing this introduction, and after he was done, he came walking over, and he was like, "Hey, brother," he's like, "Who are you? Like, I feel like I should know you." And I was like, "Oh no, it's okay. If we don't know each other, that's fine." So I, introduced myself very much like I did at the beginning of the podcast. Oh, each while, antapa chokoletsa, anits tamines, halal, couch and lax. And then I shared my parents, and he was like, "Oh yeah, yeah." He's like, I know your dad." And I'm like, "Oh, right on, like it's so cool." And then I was like, I also have relatives in Musqueam. He goes, "Oh, who's that?" And I shared my Uncle Larry and Uncle Howard Grant, and then he was like, "Oh, I know your family." And then so like it was really cool to have those moments. And it's not ceremony per se, but it's a part of our protocols. And I think it's so important that we have those opportunities to uphold our
mm.
protocol, and properly introducing ourselves. And I think once we have the opportunity to continue to introduce those smaller pieces that are foundational learning pieces for our people to be able to share it with the people who've settled on our territories, I think that's a really strong opportunity for relationship building.
Oh, 100%. And yeah, in some ways, as you say, that's like an extension of ceremony, right? We learn how to conduct ourselves in respectful and good ways in ceremony, and then we carry that out into the world outside ceremony to just uphold good relationships with people, right? And I think that, that's a may not totally be universal across all Indigenous nations, but it's pretty common. Like
Mm-hmm.
no matter who I meet across the continent, they behave that way according to like the protocols of their people, and it's about, yeah, like trying to make a good place for the wider community, with a shared understanding of our responsibilities to the land itself too.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, when you meet people from other cultures who conduct themselves and engage that way too, that it's a positive byproduct of being in ceremony, and just trying to be a good person. And yeah, I think it's a wonderful thing that we meet these people, we come into these different circles, and we feel familiar, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even if it's like all the way over there where you are, or up north in Nunavut, or way out east, or wherever else, like we find those familiar bonds amongst Indigenous people because of that perspective that a lot of our ceremonial practices have.
Yeah, and then I always kind of like joke around too, because like you, the even those small like introduction processes are like so ingrained in our communities, and like you're saying, like they're taught to us at a very young age, and a lot of the times it is in observations in ceremony, yeah, even in my younger years, having those opportunities to, when elders are asking, like, oh, like, who do you belong to? Who is your parents? Like, where are you from? Who are your grandparents? And it's just like
Hmm.
so funny to be able to like look back at all of those opportunities, even though I was a scared little boy, I still managed to answer all of them
Yeah. Yeah.
correctly. And so,
Hmm.
hmm
That's cool.
yeah, yeah, and as we're looking at some of these teachings that we carry with us, how to carry ourselves properly, and conduct yourself in those protocols of introductions or whatever it might look like. What are some teachings that you carry with you that have helped really guide your life and in your journey?
I think I was taught at a very young age to listen in a very engaged and respectful way, and always ensure I'm giving space to people to share what they need to, and not necessarily always deferring to others, but just allowing that time to ground myself and allow that other individual to ground themselves in me, right? So I think, for my whole life, people have always thought I was like really shy and quiet, because I never talked first. I let somebody else talk first. But it's like not the case at all. I'm quite the opposite of shy. But that's sort of what I learned, from my family, is that, you have to be respectful, and you, by allowing somebody the space, you're sort of accommodating them as a good host, and as just a mindful community member. So that's like a teaching I learned from a very young age that I think I still employ to this day. Um, but also, just the respect I have for the natural world around us, I think, is something that we all should abide by. And for me, it's about giving thanks whenever I can, at a body of water, at a tree somewhere, or something that I'm about to harvest from the bush. Understanding that reciprocity, right?
Mm.
Because when you give back for something that you're taking, firmly engages you with the natural world around you, but it also applies to those relationships that you're making with people too. And I think that listening time also ties into that reciprocal nature of relationship building at the same time too, right?
Mm.
So yeah, it's just understanding where we fit in, where others fit into our circles, where we can work together with others to make good communities, and always being mindful of the natural world around us and how we need to maintain it, how that's our responsibility as human beings, not to live as a result of the land, but to live with it, to harmoniously coexist so that everything in the natural world around us thrives. And like, that's not necessarily what I do like in my day job, or like that's not a practice that's inherently part of my day to day, but it is something that's in my mind all the time. And I think that comes down to just, again, grounding yourself in place, in relation to others, and in relation to, Mother Earth and all of creation, essentially.
Mm. Aishka. Yeah, it's very important to have those opportunities, and even thinking about some of those teachings that are carried on. And like when I was up at the feasting house up in Grass Mountain there, one of the things that I love to see, they in our traditions out in Coast Salish territory, we have often cedar above the door, and that's to really help you know keep those like Irish those good feelings, in the home. And even just observing on the weekend, as when I was in it's out in Laleham, they had tables set up in the gymnasium for the AGM meeting, and it was set up, around. It was in a just set up in a square, but that was more representation of what it's like for our people. We're all like sitting in a circle, and no one's no one's above or below anyone. We're all on that same level. They actually had cedar um, on each table around the whole, and there had to have been, at least, 40, 50 of us there. And every single person had cedar. And I was just like, oh, I love seeing like those small details. That means so much.
Mm-hmm.
You're bringing those Aishkwalowans forward, those good feelings forward into the world. You're coming with those good intentions, and I love seeing stuff like that. And even some of the smaller details. And I was sharing with our group. Even like, because not everyone got to hear mine and William's introduction to each other. But I got to share with the group afterwards, like, this is why we do it, to connect on a human level,
Mm-hmm.
introduce ourselves, and then we get to share who our family is. And it's all, sometimes it's all the small things that build up to make the most important things happen.
Yeah.
And specifically in the revitalization of our language and culture. And yeah, sometimes it's just those small acts, that make so much. And I was sharing with our group, like, when we were up there, it's, we don't need these huge grand gestures. Like, we just want to be treated with love and respect. And and as we continue to learn and grow together, I'm hoping that you will adopt some of our people's ways, and like introductions, for instance. And so it's really cool to implement some of these teachings to that have been passed on to me, on to others.
Mm-hmm.
You
No, we go straight on. Yeah.
Yeah, and so as we're taking a look into some of the teachings that we've received, I'd love to open the floor to you to share any teachings or words of wisdom for our listeners today.
Miigwech. Let's see. Dig into my bag of teachings. No, just kidding. I think like when I'm out there, I do a lot of community visits, a lot of public speaking, and oftentimes like I'll be a Anishinaabe person in a place that's outside of our traditional territory, right? Or I'll be within our territory, but there may not be many other Anishinaabe in the setting or whatever else. So I always, as you're saying with the introductions, right? It's really important to place yourself in relation to where you are, your family lineage, your community, etc., so that people understand the great diversity within just our own individual nations. Right?
Mm-hmm.
There is a spectrum of experiences that I think we as Indigenous people are still coming to terms with, that non-Indigenous people definitely have to understand. That there is not just one way to be Anishinaabe or one way to be just Indigenous in general, because colonialism has impacted all of our communities in different ways. And when I was saying earlier, like in the 80s, as I was seeing my community revive these old ways, neighboring communities not far from ours weren't on the same trajectory that we were,
Mm.
right? And for some of them, it took a little bit longer. Some of them were farther ahead. And, it takes sort of that candid, honest sharing with each other to understand the challenges that we all have in finding our way back to culture and healing. And for me, as someone who is often like in representative roles, I always underline that, my experience is one of several, and my path to culture and healing is not like the blueprints, and
Mm.
it's not necessarily applicable to everybody else, and it's maybe not that easy to replicate either, you know.
Mm.
Um, so I always remind people, and our people too, our Anishinaabe relatives, and our indigenous neighbors and friends, relatives in other nations and cultures, that the more we share, the more we can sort of fill in the spectrum and offer different experiences to other people and find examples for whatever path to healing and culture may be most applicable to you, right? I think there's always lots of space for everybody's story. You hear a lot of different experiences and recollections of what it was like to overcome trauma, find culture, and so on. But like someone here in Sudbury may not find that outlet as easily as somebody in a different community in Southern Ontario, Northern Ontario, wherever else, right?
Mm.
Yeah, I always ask people to come into that understanding about us as Indigenous people with an open mind, with kindness,
Mm.
uh, with patience as well, and also the overall recognition that sharing these things is going to make us all better in the long run. Us as Indigenous people, Canadians, other non-Indigenous people, etc. By laying out, this broad spectrum of experiences, will, I think, fill in some of those gaps that Canada created about Indigenous awareness, right? So that ultimately means making the time and the space for people to share their stories
Mm.
wherever and however they need to do it. So yeah, that's on a regular everyday basis, that's what I sort of suggest all people keep in mind, whether they're Indigenous or not, and just understanding that, sure, we've seen, as we've both mentioned today, we've seen so much progress in just the last 10, 15, 20 years, but there's still a long way to go too,
Mm.
and I think having those conversations is going to sort of get us on a more on a wider and, I think, more beneficial path to do that.
Mm. Hachka. Yeah, I was like sharing with our group on Monday about some of the journeys that we've gone on as Indigenous people to continue to preserve and in some cases really take that revitalization process seriously,
Mhm.
and the introduction of our traditional ways into the world are becoming more common. And it was encouraging our group to come into the learning process with an open heart and an open mind. um, and it's gonna happen. Like you're gonna make a mistake somewhere along the line, and I just encouraged people to um, be okay with that. And I was sharing with our group, like, we didn't come into this world knowing how to do a lot of things. We didn't know how to walk, we didn't know how to talk, and we had to learn. And my mom always said, like, what she shared with me, like, when you were learning to walk, I saw you fall, and when you were learning to talk, I heard you mispronounce words. So we had to learn. And so, like, I encourage the people who've settled into our lands and our territories to inviting them on this journey with us as we're revitalizing our language and culture, and those parts that they have the opportunity to be welcomed in. If they are, take that opportunity to come in and learn and just sit and watch and observe.
Mhm.
And yeah, and so come with an open heart and open mind. Those are the words that have been at the top of mind for me this last like week and a bit. So,
Mhm. Bring it on. Yeah, I love that. Miguel, thanks for sharing that.
thanks, Jessica. And as we're looking at our last piece here, I'd love to give you the floor to share with our listeners, all the things that you have going on, and for opportunities if people wanted to book some of your time, and how they might be able to get in touch with you.
Oh, okay, Miguel, for the opportunity. Yeah, I guess like the biggest thing to plug is the books that I got out there, because that's
Mm.
how I feed my kids, and
Mm-hmm.
book sales. My most recent novel is called Moon of the Turning Leaves. It's the sequel to a novel called Moon of the Crested Snow. You can find both of those books almost everywhere. They're classified as post-apocalyptic stories. They're about a Anishinaabe community in the aftermath of a big collapse. And what it shows is how this community, essentially is liberated by this world ending event and is able to revive a lot of cultural practices and, live freely on the land because society has fallen apart, right? The settler society. It's not to say it's all like hunky dory after that. There are challenges this community faces, but for me, it was an opportunity to look at what essentially decolonization could look like in the future, in the aftermath of a world-ending event. And it was entirely informed by my upbringing in my Anishinaabe community, and I wanted to make it like as, I guess, proudly an Anishinaabe story as possible. Both books together. So yeah, it's been fun to have those stories out there. The great honor and great privilege of traveling a lot to share those books with communities all over the place. I'm working on another novel now, which is sort of outside of that series. It's hopefully a little more comedic. It's a res comedy, I hope anyway. It's always so hard to try to make something funny because something funny to you may not necessarily be funny to somebody else. But it's a story about bingo on the res and what it means and doesn't mean to a lot of people, right? So, so that book will be out in about a year and a half, I think. But otherwise, if people want to get in touch, my website is just waub.ca, waub.ca. And if you want to invite me to your community, I'd be honored to come. There's contact information there to make that happen. But if you want to find me on social media, I guess I probably use Instagram the most. You can find me there at Waub, at WAUB, but I got a Facebook page too. I just, it's just such an honor on this journey that I'm on to visit Indigenous communities and learn about culture, practices, history, and so on, right across Turtle Island, and I was afforded this opportunity or these opportunities because I was empowered to share Anishinaabe stories and culture, and use and sort of adapt them to journalism and to literature, right? And that's just, to me, it's helped build bridges and strengthen bonds between my specific Anishinaabe culture and other cultures throughout the land, right? So I just, any opportunity for cultural exchange within Indigenous nations is just so cool. It's the it's truly international when you think about it, right? Like what you and I are doing today. We're so far apart where we grew up, but we have so much in common at the same time. And we're learning about our beautiful differences too as Indigenous people and our customs, right? So to see all these things happening nowadays is just so exciting. And as a dad, as an uncle, as I guess a mentor to a lot of younger people, it's so awesome to see the world they're growing up in. It is like night and day compared to 2-3 generations ago. It's just I'm grateful to be a part of whatever you want to call this movement towards revitalization of culture and so on. But I'm humbly doing my best to represent myself, my family, my community, and just Indigenous people in general as best as I can.
Thank you for Waub, for taking the time to come and sit with me today and have this impactful and important and meaningful conversation. I love being able to share and sit down with a lot of different people to hear where they are in their journey, to hear what it looks like for them, to what culture means to them, and how culture is bringing healing to their lives and to their families. And I absolutely love hearing people's stories, and thank you for sharing your stories with me and our listeners today. And thank you for your time. And I'd like to thank our listeners of the Culture is Healing podcast, and I look forward to catching you all in the next one. Take care, everyone. Haichka.
Miigwech. Thank you, everyone.